Before snacking was an industry, it was a Tuesday afternoon. A jar of peanut butter, a stalk of celery someone forgot to throw away. Nobody photographed it. Nobody needed to. This was 1970s America. Tupperware on the counter, a radio playing low, a mother who could feed 6 kids off ingredients that cost less than $1 combined. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. They didn't invent snacking. They interrupted it. 22 of these recipes disappeared so a factory could sell you something worse in a bag. Tonight, we bring them back. All of them. Number 1, ants on a log 3 ingredients. That's all it ever was. A rib of celery, split down its groove, filled with peanut butter still warm from a knife dragged straight from the jar. Raisins pressed in a row on top. The ants. A child could make it. A child usually did. In suburban kitchens of the early 1970s, this snack cost about 8 cents a serving and required no oven, no stove, no supervision, no box, no wrapper. No expiration date printed anywhere because nothing in it was designed to expire. Grandma just called it something to hold you over. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 2, no-bake cookie oats and peanut butter folded into a pot of melted sugar and cocoa on the stovetop. Never the oven. In rural kitchens across the South and Midwest, where summer heat made lighting an oven an act of self-punishment, this was the only cookie a house could survive making, drop by spoonful onto wax paper. Let the counter do the baking. By 1975, a batch cost around 4 cents a cookie and fed a family of 5 without anyone sweating through supper. This was not a recipe. This was a workaround for a house with no air conditioning, built by a woman who refused to go without dessert. Number 3, popcorn balls corn syrup, boiled until it turned the color of caramel, poured hot over a bowl of popped corn and shaped fast, before it set, in hands that didn't flinch from the heat, wrapped in wax paper, twisted at both ends like candy from a general store. In small towns across America, these were the Halloween treat, homemade, handed out door to door, no questions asked. By the late 1970s, a single ball cost about 3 cents to make. That tradition didn't fade on its own. Fear killed it. Rumors of tampered treats did what no shortage ever could. They made a mother's kitchen suspicious. Number 4, Watergate salad pistachio pudding powder, folded dry into whipped topping, crushed pineapple, and a fistful of miniature marshmallows. No baking, no cooking, just a bowl and a spoon and 20 minutes in the icebox to set. It showed up on covered dish tables at church potlucks by the mid-1970s, costing around 10 cents a serving, and nobody fully agreed on why it carried that name. Some blamed the color. Some blamed the era. Nobody complained about the taste. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. This salad contained more genuine dairy and fruit than half of what gets called healthy today, and it never once claimed to be. Number 5, Ambrosia salad canned mandarin oranges, shredded coconut, a can of fruit cocktail, drained careful so the syrup didn't water down the bowl, folded together with sour cream or whipped topping, chilled overnight, served the next day like it had always been there. On Southern Sunday tables of the 1970s, this dish cost around 12 cents a serving and required no special occasion to justify it. Sunday itself was occasion enough. This was not dessert. This was celebration built from a pantry shelf by a woman who didn't need a bakery to prove her table mattered. Number 6, stuffed celery, a rib of celery, washed and dried, split down the center, and packed tight with cream cheese, softened on the counter, never in a microwave, because most kitchens didn't have one yet. Pressed smooth with the flat of a knife. Sometimes a dusting of paprika on top, red against the pale green, just for the look of it, sliced into 2-inch pieces and arranged on a plate like something worth arranging. In suburban kitchens of the 1970s, this cost about 6 cents a stick, and it sat on nearly every party tray in the country. Birthdays, showers, holidays, the occasional Tuesday that needed dressing up for no particular reason, it looked fancy. It wasn't. That was the entire trick, and every mother in America knew it. Cream cheese was cheap. Celery was cheaper. The paprika cost pennies and did all the visual work of a dish that took 12 minutes to assemble. That is not a garnish. That is a woman stretching a grocery budget into something that photographed like it came from a caterer, because she understood something modern food forgot. Presentation was never about money. It was about care. Nobody sells that ingredient anymore. You can't buy it in a jar. Number 7. Cheese ball cream cheese, shredded sharp cheddar, a spoonful of Worcestershire, sometimes a nub of onion grated so fine it disappeared into the mix entirely, worked together by hand until it held its shape, then rolled, actually rolled, palm over palm, into a sphere and pressed into a bed of chopped walnuts or pecans until every inch of it was covered. Wrapped in plastic, chilled overnight, set on the table beside a fan of crackers, and left to be discovered. In homes across the country through the 1970s, a cheese ball like this cost around 20 cents a serving to make, feeding a room of a dozen guests for less than the price of a single soda today. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. That same cheese ball, unchanged, is now sold at grocery delis and served at wine bars as a cheese board centerpiece, priced at $18 for a portion smaller than what one mother made on a Tuesday for free. This was not an appetizer. This was proof that a woman with cream cheese and a bag of nuts could set a table that looked like it belonged somewhere fancier than it was. Nobody needed a caterer. Nobody needed a budget. They needed 40 minutes and a roll of plastic wrap. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know about all of this. In 1955, the Lipton Recipe Soup Mix Company printed a small recipe on the back of its onion soup packet. Dry mix, sour cream, nothing else. It wasn't an ad. It didn't look like one. It looked like a suggestion, the kind a neighbor might scribble on an index card. By the 1970s, that recipe had become one of the most served dips in American history, and it had never cost Lipton a single advertising dollar beyond the ink on the box. Every woman who made it for a bridge club or a backyard barbecue was, without knowing it, running free advertising for a corporation that had figured out something the rest of the industry hadn't yet learned. You don't have to sell a product. You just have to sell the recipe and let word of mouth do the rest. That is not homemade. That is the first draft of modern marketing, printed in small type on cardboard, mistaken for a decade by millions of trusting kitchens as one woman's clever idea. They knew things about selling us food that we will spend the next 50 years trying to fully understand. This was step 1. Number 8. Lipton Onion Dip a packet of dry onion soup mix, torn open and stirred into a carton of sour cream until the flecks of dried onion turned soft and the whole bowl went the color of weak coffee. No cooking, no waiting, really. 30 minutes in the icebox, and it was ready, thick enough to hold a potato chip, standing straight up without breaking. By the mid-1970s, this dip sat on nearly every coffee table in suburban America during a football game or a holiday gathering, costing about 5 cents a serving to make. A bowl that fed a dozen people for less than the price of a single bag of the chips beside it. Nobody called it gourmet. Nobody needed to. It disappeared for the same reason so much of this list disappeared. A corporation figured out how to sell the convenience version back to us in a plastic tub, seasoned with less and priced with more, and an entire generation forgot they used to make it themselves in under a minute. Grandma just called it the dip. She never once needed a brand name to prove it was good. Number 9. Cocktail Weenie's Little Smoked Sausages, dumped straight from the package into a saucepan with a jar of grape jelly and a bottle of chili sauce, stirred over low heat until the jelly melted down into something sweet and dark and faintly spiced. Served straight from the pot with toothpicks stuck in each one, kept warm on the stove all afternoon while a party moved through the kitchen. in suburban homes across the country through the 1970s. This dish cost around 15 cents a serving and asked for exactly two ingredients beyond the sausages themselves. Nothing measured with precision. Nothing that required a recipe card to remember. Nobody explains that combination anymore. Grape jelly and chili sauce sound like a mistake until you taste what they become together. Sweet cut by heat, heat softened by sweet, the kind of balance a food scientist would need a lab to reverse engineer today. This was not a random pairing. This was a working mother's chemistry, discovered by accident in a kitchen with no time for anything fancier, and it fed a room full of guests for the price of pocket change. Number 10. Rumakia water chestnut, sliced thin, wrapped around a sliver of chicken liver, marinated in soy sauce and brown sugar, the whole bundle pinned tight with a strip of bacon and a toothpick, then broiled until the bacon curled and crisped at the edges while the inside stayed tender. This one came from somewhere else entirely. West Coast tiki bars of the late 1960s, part of a wave of Polynesian-inspired entertaining that swept into American living rooms and brought its appetizers with it. By the 1970s, a home cook could make a tray of these for around 25 cents apiece, serving something that felt imported without ever leaving the kitchen. It required patience most modern snacking has forgotten how to demand. The wrapping, the pinning, the timing of bacon against liver so neither one burned before the other cooked through. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. A snack this labor-intensive, this specific, could only survive in a culture that still valued spending an hour on something meant to be eaten in one bite. That patience is the ingredient nobody sells anymore. Number 11. Deviled eggs, hard-boiled eggs, halved and their yolks scooped into a bowl, mashed smooth with mayonnaise, a spoonful of mustard, and a shake of paprika dusted across the top once the filling was piped back in. Sometimes with a spoon, sometimes with a plastic bag and the corner snipped off. Whichever tool the kitchen had on hand that day, every family in America seemed to own one deviled egg plate, a dish with shallow oval wells, made for exactly this and nothing else, brought out for potlucks, funerals, picnics, and holidays alike. In the 1970s, a dozen eggs cost around 35 cents total, making this one of the cheapest dishes on any table. At roughly 3 cents an egg, that is not a coincidence. That is the entire genius of it. A dish elegant enough for a funeral reception and cheap enough for a Tuesday picnic, made from the same 12 eggs sitting in the icebox regardless of the occasion. They knew things about stretching a dozen eggs into an entire course that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Back when nobody threw anything away because nothing cost so little that it could be wasted without consequence. Number 12. Pigs in a blanket cocktail-sized sausages, wrapped tight in a strip of biscuit dough or crescent roll dough pinched at the seam, baked until the dough turned golden and split slightly at the edges where the sausage inside had started to brown. This was the snack at every children's birthday party across 1970s America, served warm on a platter alongside a bowl of ketchup for dipping, costing around 4 cents apiece to make. A tray of 2 dozen for less than $1 total. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. That same combination, sausage, pastry, nothing else, is now served at upscale bars under the name Artisan Franks and Puff Pastry, priced at $12 for 4 pieces, plated with a smear of mustard aioli that costs the restaurant less than a nickel to make. This was not an appetizer for adults trying to impress each other. This was a snack built for children, made by mothers who understood that dough and sausage, baked together, needed no aioli and no upcharge to taste like something worth remembering 40 years later. Here's what the science actually says about all of this, every dish so far. The eggs, the cream cheese, the sausages, the sour cream came from real dairy, real protein, real sugar measured by a hand that had made the recipe 100 times before. Nothing in a 1970s kitchen needed a label, because nothing in it was engineered to be anything other than what it appeared to be. That same decade, on the other side of the country, food chemists were beginning work on something different. Hydrogenated oils, stabilized to survive months on a shelf, and synthetic flavor compounds designed to trick a mouth into recognizing a taste that was never actually there. The technology wasn't fully in grocery stores yet, but the research had already started, quietly, in labs that had nothing to do with anyone's kitchen. That is not progress. That is the moment food stopped being made and started being formulated. A shift so gradual that most families never noticed the day real butter became shortening and real cheese became cheese product. She was right. Everything she knew was right. A cream cheese ball rolled by hand contained fewer ingredients than a bag of chips does today, and nobody needed a chemistry degree to understand why it tasted better. Number 13. Snickerdoodle's butter, sugar, flour, and eggs worked into a soft dough rolled into balls the size of a walnut, then rolled again through a shallow dish of cinnamon and sugar until every side was coated. Baked until the edges turned golden and the tops cracked slightly, the cinnamon darkening just at the crevices where the dough had split open in the oven. In farm kitchens across the Midwest through the 1970s, a single cookie cost about 2 cents to make, and a batch of 3 dozen fed an entire family through a week of school lunches and after-supper desserts alike. Cinnamon, once a spice too expensive for anyone but the wealthy to use freely, had become common enough by this decade that a farm wife could dust it over cookies without a second thought about the cost. That is not a small thing. That is centuries of spice trade history collapsing into a Tuesday afternoon baking session, where a woman with a rolling pin had access to a flavor that kings once fought wars over, and she used it to make something a child could eat with both hands. Number 14. Buckeye's peanut butter, powdered sugar, and softened butter worked together into a stiff dough and rolled into balls, then dipped in melted chocolate, but never all the way. A circle of peanut butter was always left showing at the top, bare against the chocolate shell, made to look like the seed of the buckeye tree the candy was named for. Ohio kitchens claimed this one first, and by the 1970s it had spread across the Midwest, costing around 6 cents per piece to make, with a single batch producing several dozen candies from ingredients most pantries already had on hand. That bare circle of peanut butter wasn't a mistake in the dipping technique. It was the entire point, a detail added on purpose, a small act of craftsmanship in a candy nobody was getting paid to perfect. This was not a shortcut dessert. This was a woman deciding that even a peanut butter ball deserved to look like something specific, something recognizable, something with a name and a story behind it, rather than just another chocolate-covered lump pulled from a bowl and served without a second thought to how it looked on the plate. Number 15. Divinity egg whites, beaten stiff, folded slowly into a pot of corn syrup and sugar boiled to precisely the right temperature. Too cool and it never set, too hot and it turned to sugar rock instead of the soft, cloud-white candy it was supposed to become. Dropped by spoonfuls onto wax paper, sometimes studded with a pecan half pressed into the top before it hardened. Southern holiday tables through the 1970s counted on this candy every December, costing around 4 cents apiece, though it demanded something no other item on this list required in equal measure: a candy thermometer, careful timing, and a cook who wouldn't rush the process even when the kitchen was full of relatives waiting. This was not a recipe for a beginner. This was a test some women passed and others quietly avoided year after year because a failed batch of divinity meant grainy sugar syrup that never set. and an entire pot of ingredients wasted. They knew things about candy making that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember, back when patience itself was treated as an ingredient worth measuring as carefully as the sugar. Number 16. Haystack's butterscotch chips, melted slow over low heat, stirred together with chow mein noodles until every noodle was coated thin and glossy, then dropped by clumps onto wax paper and left to harden into small, spiky mounds that looked exactly like their name promised. Church bake sales across the Midwest counted on these through the 1970s, where a single haystack cost around 6 cents to make, and a full batch could fill an entire card table without requiring an oven, a mixer, or more than 15 minutes of a cook's attention. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. That same combination, unchanged in any meaningful way, is now sold in bakery cases and specialty shops as no-bake clusters, priced at $8 a dozen for a candy that a church volunteer once made for a fraction of a cent per piece using ingredients from a grocery store aisle nobody thought twice about. This was not a delicate confection built for admiration. This was a fast, cheap, reliable candy built for a folding table and a crowd, and it never once needed a fancier name to earn its place there. Number 17. Homemade granola rolled oats, spread thick across a sheet pan, drizzled with honey and oil, scattered with chopped nuts, and sometimes a handful of raisins, then baked low and slow, stirred every 10 minutes so it toasted evenly instead of burning at the edges. This one arrived through health food co-ops and farm kitchens in the early to mid-1970s, part of a genuine countercultural push against processed cereal. A batch cost around 10 cents a serving and lasted a household weeks stored in a jar on the counter. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. This exact recipe, oats, honey, nuts, nothing else, is the same food that eventually became the granola bar, except somewhere along the way, a company added corn syrup, palm oil, and enough sugar to outpace the cookie it was invented to replace, then sold it back to us at $6 a box under a label promising wholesome ingredients. That is not progress. That is a decade of nutrition science discovered by home cooks first, quietly reverse-engineered by a corporation that understood the word healthy sold products, even when the product itself no longer earned it. She was right. Everything she knew was right, long before anyone put a health claim on a box to prove it. Number 18. Gorp peanuts, raisins, and small candy pieces, tossed together in whatever bowl was handy, poured into a paper sack or an old coffee can, and carried along on hikes, camping trips, and long car rides where a family needed food that wouldn't melt, spoil, or require a fork. Boy Scout troops and hiking clubs across 1970s America relied on this mix, costing around 9 cents a serving to assemble from 3 pantry staples that most households already kept stocked for exactly this purpose. Nobody agreed on what the name stood for. Some claimed it meant good old raisins and peanuts. Others insisted it was simply the sound a mouth made eating a fistful too fast. Either way, it required no recipe card, no measuring cup, no instructions beyond a rough sense of proportion built entirely from memory. Today, that same mix sits behind glass in specialty stores labeled Premium Trail Mix, selling for $7 a bag, dressed up with dried mango and yogurt-covered pretzels that add cost without adding anything a hiker actually needed. This was not a product. This was 3 ingredients a mother kept in the pantry, specifically because they never went bad and never needed her attention once they were poured into the bag. Number 19. Monkey bread refrigerator biscuit dough, torn into small pieces, rolled through cinnamon sugar, and layered into a bundt pan, then drenched in a butter and brown sugar syrup poured over the top before baking, until the whole thing rose into one sticky, pull-apart loaf that had to be flipped upside down onto a plate the moment it came out of the oven. Sunday mornings across 1970s, America started with this dish more often than any other, costing around 8 cents a serving and requiring no slicing, no plates even. If a family didn't mind pulling pieces straight off the loaf with their fingers, that was the entire ritual. Nobody cut clean slices. Everybody reached in with their hands, pulled a sticky piece free, and let the syrup run down their wrist before licking it off between bites. That is not a breakfast recipe. That is a Sunday morning built entirely around the act of sharing one dish from one pan, hands overlapping, syrup connecting everyone at the table to the same loaf in a way a plate of individually portioned toast never could accomplish. Number 20. Magic cookie bars, a layer of graham cracker crumbs pressed into a pan, topped with a full can of sweetened condensed milk poured evenly across, then layered with chocolate chips, shredded coconut, and chopped nuts, pressed down gently and baked until the edges turned deep gold, and the condensed milk had bound every layer together into one solid bar. Suburban kitchens through the 1970s leaned on this dessert constantly, costing around 7 cents a serving, requiring exactly one pan, one layering motion, and 0 mixing bowls. A rarity for a decade that measured a recipe's worth partly by how few dishes it left behind. This recipe traces back to sweetened condensed milk itself, a product invented in the 1850s to solve a dairy spoilage problem, and by the 1970s it had become the quiet backbone of dozens of no-fuss desserts in kitchens that didn't always have reliable refrigeration for fresh cream. Grandma just called it dump bars, because that's exactly what the recipe was. Dump each layer in, press it down, bake it, done. She was right. Everything she knew was right, especially about which desserts were worth the extra dish to clean. Number 21. Frozen banana pops a ripe banana, halved and skewered on a popsicle stick, dipped in melted chocolate, and rolled through chopped peanuts before being laid flat on a tray and frozen solid until the chocolate shell cracked clean with the first bite. Summer kitchens across the country made these through the 1970s at a cost of around 3 cents each, using fruit that was already starting to spot on the counter and would have gone to waste otherwise. This was not a health food marketed as one. Nobody called it guilt-free or printed a calorie count anywhere near it. It was simply a way to stretch a bruised banana into a cold dessert on a hot afternoon, using nothing but a stick, a pan of melted chocolate, and a freezer that most families had only recently been able to afford. That is not a coincidence, and that is not a small detail. A dessert built from fruit that was about to be thrown away is the exact opposite of everything modern snack marketing has spent 50 years teaching us to forget how to do. Number 22. Homemade popsicles. Kool-Aid powder, stirred into a pitcher of water and sugar, poured into small paper cups or plastic molds with a wooden stick or spoon handle balanced upright in the center, then frozen overnight until the whole cup turned solid and could be peeled away, leaving behind a bright, hard, ice-cold pop in whatever color the powder had promised. In trailer parks and rural kitchens across the South, through the 1970s, this cost less than a single cent per pop, a pitcher of powder and water stretching into a dozen treats that kept a houseful of children quiet through the hottest part of a summer afternoon. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. That same idea, sugar water, frozen on a stick, was eventually bottled, branded, and sold back to us in plastic sleeves for 50 cents apiece, marketed as a novelty, rather than acknowledged as something every mother in America had already figured out for free, decades before a corporation put a name on it and charged for the privilege. This was not a treat that needed inventing. It needed remembering, and somewhere along the way, we let a company convince us they'd thought of it first. Number 23. Cinnamon toast, a slice of white bread, toasted just until it stiffened, then buttered edge to edge while it was still warm enough to melt straight into the crust. Cinnamon and sugar, mixed together in a small dish, kept on the counter for exactly this purpose, sprinkled thick over the butter, and pressed in slightly with the back of a spoon so it wouldn't shake loose on the walk to the table. Kitchens across the country leaned on this through the 1970s as an after-school staple, costing less than 2 cents a slice, made in the time it took a child to hang up a coat and ask what there was to eat. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. That same slice of bread, unchanged, is now served at brunch spots under the name Cinnamon Toast, priced at $9 a plate, sometimes with a scoop of mascarpone added specifically to justify the markup. This was not an appetizer for adults with time to spare. This was the fastest thing a mother could make with 2 hands and a toaster, and it never once needed a fancy name to taste like exactly what a child wanted after a long day at school. Number 24. Sausage Balls Ground Breakfast Sausage, worked raw into a bowl with shredded cheddar and buttermilk baking mix, no liquid added beyond what the sausage itself gave up. Rolled into balls the size of a golf ball and baked on a sheet pan until the outside turned deep brown and the inside stayed juicy from the fat rendered right into the dough. Holiday mornings across the South relied on this dish through the 1970s, costing around 8 cents a piece, made in batches of several dozen because nobody ever made just enough. There was always a cousin arriving late who'd want some too. 3 ingredients. No bowl to clean beyond the one they were mixed in. No oven timer needed beyond a glance through the glass door to check the color. That is not a recipe that required skill. That is a dish built entirely around efficiency. Feeding a house full of relatives on Christmas morning without the cook ever having to leave the living room for longer than it took to check on the oven, because the actual work had already been done the night before, hands in a bowl, sausage and cheese and baking mix pressed together in 15 minutes flat. Number 25. Pickle roll-ups, a slice of deli ham, laid flat and spread edge to edge with softened cream cheese, a whole dill pickle spear placed at one end and rolled tight until the ham wrapped around it completely. Then sliced crosswise into small pinwheels that revealed the pickle sitting dead center in a spiral of pink and white, refrigerator staples across 1970s kitchens. These cost around 4 cents apiece and required no cooking at all, just a knife, a cutting board, and a jar of pickles that most pantries kept stocked regardless of the season. Grandma just called it something to put out when company showed up unannounced, because that's exactly what it was for. A snack that could be assembled in 10 minutes from 3 refrigerator staples. Requiring no trip to the store and no advance planning, this was not a dish invented to impress anyone at a dinner party. This was a woman's answer to the doorbell, ringing on a Tuesday afternoon with no warning, built from ingredients she already had on hand, sliced into pinwheels specifically because they looked more thought out than they actually were. She was right. Everything she knew was right. A jar of pickles and a package of ham could turn an unplanned visit into something that looked, at least, like she'd been expecting company all along, closing 22 snacks. Not one of them came from a factory. Roll a cheese ball through a bed of walnuts. Stir a packet of onion soup into sour cream and watch it turn into the dip everyone reaches for first. Pull apart a loaf of monkey bread with your bare hands and let the syrup run down your wrist, because that was always the point. These women didn't need a nutrition label to know what they were feeding their families. They needed a kitchen drawer, a windowsill catching the afternoon sun, and 45 minutes between finishing the dishes and calling everyone to the table. Nobody photographed what they made. Nobody needed to. It was gone within the hour, and it was made again the next week, exactly the same, because it worked. That is not nostalgia. That is a generation of women who fed entire families on pennies, using ingredients a corporation would spend the next 50 years trying to synthesize, package, and sell back to their grandchildren at 20 times the price. A cheese ball rebranded as a charcuterie centerpiece. A trail mix rebranded as premium. A frozen pop rebranded as a novelty. They didn't lose these recipes. We had them taken if your grandmother made even one of these. The ants on a log, the Buckeyes, the popsicles frozen in a paper cup. Comment below and tell me which one. Tell me what kitchen it came from and what her name was. Make one of these this week. Just one. Let her be right one more time.